The year is 1947. The Strait of Malacca, a stretch of ocean that sits between Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, one of the most heavily trafficked shipping lanes on Earth. Thousands of vessels pass through every year, threading between ports and continents, carrying cargo, carrying people, carrying secrets. Tonight, the ocean is dark. The sky is darker. And somewhere out there, on a vessel that no one can quite locate, something has gone terribly wrong. Two American ships, the Silver Star and the City of Baltimore, are somewhere nearby, sailing their separate courses through the night, when their radio operators pick up a signal. It comes in fits and starts, fractured and strange. The transmission is weak. But the words are unmistakable. All officers including captain are dead, lying in chart room and bridge, possibly whole crew dead. The radio operator sits very still. He waits. A pause that lasts long enough to feel like an answer. Long enough to feel like death. And then, the final line. Quieter. Slower. Almost detached, as if the person sending it has already left their own body. I die. What happened aboard that ship? No one knows. No one has ever known. And the deeper you go, the more questions you ask, the more records you search, the more sources you trace, the stranger it gets. Because this story doesn't get clearer with scrutiny. It gets darker. This is the story of the SS Ourang Medan. A ship that may or may not have existed. A crew that most certainly died. A distress signal that was received by multiple operators across multiple vessels. And a mystery that has survived, unresolved, for nearly 80 years, in the space between documented history and something far more unsettling. But let's start at the beginning. Or as close to a beginning as we can get. The name Ourang Medan is Malay. Translated, it means something like, man from Medan, Medan being a city on the northeastern coast of Sumatra. It is a name that sounds like a person. A name that sounds, in retrospect, like a warning. Details about the ship itself are surprisingly, suspiciously, difficult to pin down. Accounts vary depending on the source, the decade, and sometimes the country in which the story was being told. What we know, or think we know, is that the Ourang Medan was a Dutch-registered cargo vessel, sailing somewhere in the vicinity of the Strait of Malacca in late 1947, or possibly early 1948. The exact date is disputed. The registry is unclear. Some researchers have spent years searching for official Dutch shipping records that would confirm the vessel's existence, and have come up empty. That absence of records is significant. In the world of maritime history, ships leave trails, registry documents, manifests, port logs, customs records, insurance filings. The infrastructure of oceanic commerce is built on paperwork, on accountability, on traceability. A ship that sails without a paper trail is a ship that someone, somewhere, did not want traced. This detail, the strange blankness surrounding the Ourang Medan's origins, is one that investigators and historians would return to again and again. It does not explain what happened on board. But it suggests that whatever the ship was carrying, it may not have been the kind of cargo that appears on a standard manifest. And that, as you'll come to understand, changes everything about this story. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's return to that radio signal. The distress call received by the Silver Star and the City of Baltimore was, by all accounts, deeply unusual in its character. Not just in content, but in transmission. The SOS itself was clear enough. The coordinates were provided. But radio operators who reported receiving the signal described something in the quality of the transmission that unsettled them in ways they struggled to articulate. The signal wasn't simply weak. It was wrong. Somehow. The rhythm of the Morse code was irregular in ways that didn't match equipment failure or inexperience. It was as if the person sending it had lost command of their own hands. The distress message was received, triangulated, and a position was established. The Silver Star, being the closer vessel, altered course to investigate. Her captain ordered full speed. The crew prepared for a rescue operation, lifeboats readied, medical supplies staged, men positioned along the railing as the ship pushed through the dark water toward the coordinates. What no one could have prepared for was what they would find when they got there. The approach took hours. As the Silver Star closed the distance, the crew scanned the horizon in silence. The sea was calm, almost unnaturally calm, as some accounts describe it, flat and gray, and still in a way that felt less like peaceful weather and more like holding of breath. Like the ocean itself was watching. And then, in the early morning light, they saw it. The Ourang Medan was adrift. No smoke from the funnel. No movement on deck. No response to hails over the radio, which had, of course, gone silent in the moments after that last transmission. The ship sat in the water like an abandoned thing. Like a shell. The Silver Star circled the vessel once before moving to come alongside. There was no collision damage visible. No listing. No signs of distress from the outside. No fire. No obvious flooding. No structural failure. The ship appeared, from a distance, to be entirely intact. But something didn't add up. Even as they drew close enough to see the deck clearly, there were no crew visible. No one at the railing. No one in the bridge. The vessel was utterly, completely still. A boarding party was assembled. Several men from the Silver Star made their way across to the Ourang Medan, stepping onto the deck with the careful, tense movements of people who know they are walking into something unknown. The air, according to accounts from the rescue crew, was wrong. Not in any way they could immediately identify. The temperature was not extreme, the weather was clear enough. But there was something in it. An atmosphere that pressed against them. A quality that some of the men would later describe, struggling for the right word, as cold. Not physically cold. Cold in some other, deeper register. They moved across the deck. The first body they found was on deck, near the bow. A crew member, sprawled on the metal plating, on his back, arms and legs extended at unnatural angles, face turned upward toward the sky. Eyes open. Mouth open. The expression frozen on his face was one that the boarding party would not easily forget. Absolute, unbounded terror. Not the slack, peaceful expression of someone who had died in their sleep. Not the closed-eyed, quiet finish of illness or quiet failure. This was a face that had been confronted with something. Something that, in the final moments of this man's life, had been more terrifying than death itself. There were no wounds. No blood. No marks of violence. No sign of struggle. They moved deeper into the ship. In the chart room and on the bridge, they found more bodies. The captain. The officers. All in similar states, sprawled or slumped where they had fallen, faces locked in that same expression of absolute horror. Eyes open. Mouths open. Limbs positioned as if whatever had killed them had done so with terrifying speed, caught mid-movement, mid-gesture, mid-action, and simply switched off. And then, it gets even stranger. They found the ship's dog. It was dead, too, lying in a corridor with that same expression of paralyzed terror on its face, jaws pulled back, eyes wide. Whatever had happened on the Ourang Medan had not spared the animals. Whatever had filled those final moments with such pure, unfiltered fear had reached even into the instincts of a creature that could not reason, could not interpret, could not place into context whatever it was experiencing. Something so fundamental and overwhelming that it bypassed the rational mind entirely. The entire crew of the Ourang Medan was dead. Every one of them. Arranged in terrible silence across the ship. No sign of how they had died. No cause immediately apparent. Just the bodies and the stillness and those faces. The boarding party did not go below. Not then. Something in them. Instinct, perhaps, the same primitive alarm system that had screamed at that dog in its final moments, told them to stay in the light. To stay where they could see the sky. When they reported back to the Silver Star, the captain faced a decision. He could attempt to tow the vessel to port, where a proper investigation could be conducted, where the bodies could be examined, the cargo inspected, the records scrutinized. Or he could wait for official assistance. Before that decision could be made final, a fire broke out. The fire began in the cargo hold. Reports differ on how quickly it spread. Some say it was visible almost immediately as a column of smoke rising from below decks. Some say there was a preliminary rumbling, a shaking of the hull. The boarding party, still aboard the Ourang Medan, were forced to evacuate immediately. They scrambled back across to the Silver Star. Lines were cut. The two ships separated. The Ourang Medan exploded. Not a small fire. Not a controlled burn. An explosion of such force that the ship was reportedly blasted clear of the water before it sank. Thrown upward and outward with a violence that scattered debris across a wide radius. The men watching from the Silver Star described the detonation as enormous, incomprehensibly large given what they had seen of the ship's condition from the outside. In moments, the Ourang Medan was gone. Sunk. The evidence, the bodies, the cargo, the logbooks, whatever records might have existed on board, whatever physical traces of what had happened were available. All of it destroyed. All of it swallowed by the sea. The truth went down with the ship. But this detail changes everything. Think about what we have so far. A ship with unclear origins, carrying cargo that doesn't appear in any official record, found drifting with its entire crew dead, every person on board showing the same expression of frozen, total terror, with no visible cause of death, followed almost immediately by an explosion of unusual force that destroys all evidence before any investigation can be conducted. Any one of those elements would be strange. Together, they form something that resists easy explanation. Something that investigators, historians, researchers, and armchair detectives have been turning over for decades, looking for the seam that will let the mystery come apart. Looking for the thread that, when pulled, will make everything make sense. No one has found that thread. But there are theories. Several of them. Each one illuminating a different facet of the story. Each one, in its own way, more unsettling than the one before. The most widely discussed theory, the one that many researchers consider the most plausible, involves the cargo. If the Ourang Medan was carrying illegal or dangerous materials, it would explain the missing registry, the unclear ownership, the absence of official documentation. Ships that carry things that should not be carried tend not to leave paper trails. What might such cargo have been? In the years immediately following the Second World War, the movement of chemical weapons and chemical precursors across the Pacific and Southeast Asian regions was not uncommon. The war had generated enormous stockpiles of nerve agents, chemical compounds, and related materials. These materials needed to be disposed of, destroyed, moved, and not all of that movement was conducted through official channels. Some of it was conducted quietly, at night, on vessels that did not officially exist. Potassium cyanide, chlorine gas, various nerve agents, compounds that, under the right conditions, a leak, a reaction with seawater, a failure of containment, could kill every person aboard a ship very quickly. Kill them before they could do more than send a distress signal. Kill them with such speed and such disruption to the nervous system that their faces, at the moment of death, would be frozen in the expression of whatever they had been experiencing when the end came. What they found next was impossible to explain. Because if the deaths were caused by toxic gas, by a chemical leak in the hold, then several things follow naturally. The cause of death would be consistent with what was described. Rapid, seemingly painless from the outside, no visible wounds, no signs of struggle. The subsequent explosion would make sense if the leaking chemicals ignited. Many such compounds are highly volatile. The force of the explosion would make sense if the cargo hold was laden with reactive materials. The whole chain of events has an internal logic that is almost satisfying. Almost. Because there are things about the Ourang Medan that don't fit neatly into the toxic gas theory. The expressions on the faces of the dead, the absolute, overwhelming terror, would be consistent with the physiological effects of certain nerve agents, which cause intense convulsions and neurological disruption in their final stages. That much could be argued. But what about the radio operator? The person who sent that final transmission? I die. If the crew were being killed by an invisible, odorless gas, would he have known what was happening? Would he have understood, in those final moments, that death was coming? Or would he simply have been overwhelmed, confused, unable to identify the source of his body's failure? The phrasing of the transmission suggests awareness, suggests presence of mind, suggests a person who knew, in the most final, irreversible way, exactly what was happening to them. Not confusion, not illness, recognition. But the ship was hiding something. Other theories have been proposed over the years, and they range from the scientifically plausible to the genuinely disturbing. Some researchers have suggested that the ship may have been carrying radioactive materials, that the crew's deaths and the subsequent explosion could be consistent with a nuclear or radiological incident. In the late 1940s, in the immediate aftermath of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there was considerable clandestine movement of radioactive materials across the Pacific. The effects of acute radiation exposure can be severe, rapid, and extremely painful, and they can leave no visible mark on the body. There is a version of this theory that is even darker. That the Ourang Medan was not carrying materials accidentally. That it was carrying materials that were being transported deliberately, carefully, by people who knew exactly what they were handling and who had taken precautions that, for some reason, proved inadequate. That the deaths of the crew were not an accident at all, but the inevitable consequence of a mission that someone had decided was worth the cost. Who made that decision? Who sent those men out onto the water with a cargo so dangerous that its mere presence was a death sentence? These questions have no documented answers. They may never have documented answers. Because the people who arranged such things, in the shadow years after the war, were people who understood the value of not leaving documentation. Then there is a different category of theory entirely. A category that steps away from chemistry and physics and into territory that is harder to map. Several researchers who have studied the Ourang Medan have noted an unusual atmospheric quality to the accounts provided by the rescue crew. The descriptions of the bodies, the positions, the expressions, the strange stillness of the ship, have a character that goes beyond what chemical exposure would typically produce. People who have been killed by gas do not usually look terrified in the way these accounts describe. They look agonized, often. They look convulsed. But the specific quality of the terror described by the boarding party, the sense that these people had been confronted with something, had seen something, had encountered something, is harder to account for. Infrasound. The theory has been proposed in connection with several maritime mysteries, and it deserves consideration here. Infrasound is sound below the threshold of human hearing, frequencies too low for the ear to detect, generated naturally by weather systems, geological activity, or ocean phenomena. Research has shown that exposure to certain infrasound frequencies can cause profound psychological effects in human beings. Feelings of dread, of presence, of being watched. Hallucinations. Panic. In extreme cases, physiological effects that can be fatal. If the Ourang Medan had sailed into a zone of intense infrasound, generated by an underwater geological event, perhaps, or by the peculiar resonant properties of the Strait of Malacca, the crew might have experienced collective, escalating terror. They might have seen things, felt things, and they might, in the final moments, have died not from any external cause but from the overwhelming overload of their own nervous systems. It is a theory that explains the expressions. It explains the collective nature of the deaths, every person, simultaneously, destroyed by the same invisible force. It explains why there were no wounds, no struggle, no visible cause. It does not explain the explosion. And then, the mystery took a darker turn. Because when researchers began seriously investigating the Ourang Medan story in the second half of the 20th century, they encountered a problem that compounded every other problem. They couldn't confirm that the ship had existed at all. The absence of Dutch maritime records is striking. The Netherlands, in the post-war period, maintained detailed records of its merchant shipping, registration documents, insurance records, port logs, crew manifests. A Dutch cargo vessel of sufficient size to carry the crew described in the accounts should have left traces in multiple archives across multiple countries. Researchers have looked. Some have looked for years. And they have found nothing. No registry entry for a vessel named Ourang Medan. No port records showing the ship docking or departing from any harbor. No insurance records. No crew manifests. No customs documentation. Nothing. There are two ways to interpret this absence. The first is the interpretation that supports the theory of illegal cargo. The ship existed, but was deliberately unregistered, operating outside official channels, because its cargo was something that could not be officially declared. In this reading, the absence of records is not evidence that the ship didn't exist. It is evidence of how completely someone had erased the traces of its existence. The second interpretation is darker, in a different way. That the Ourang Medan story is, at its core, a fabrication. That the distress signal was misinterpreted, or invented, or transmitted as a prank or hoax that took on a life of its own. That the bodies, the dog, the frozen expressions of terror, all of it was invented or embellished by people who told the story, and was added to over the decades as the tale passed from sailor to journalist to historian. This second interpretation is the one that mainstream historians have tended toward. And it would be tidy and satisfying in its way, if not for one thing. Multiple independent radio operators reported receiving the same transmission, at the same time, with the same content. That is not something that is easily fabricated after the fact. But something didn't add up. The story of the Ourang Medan first appeared in print in a Dutch newspaper in 1948, not long after the supposed events. The account was detailed, specific, and attributed to named sources. It was picked up by other publications over the following years, translated into multiple languages, republished in maritime journals and in the popular press. By the 1950s, it had become one of the most widely discussed maritime mysteries of the century. And then, in 1952, the story appeared in a United States Coast Guard publication, a report on unexplained maritime events. The Coast Guard did not confirm the story as fact, but they included it. They thought it worth noting. They clearly had access to some underlying account that they considered credible enough to document. Why would an official government maritime publication include a story that was pure fabrication? The Coast Guard, like all maritime safety organizations, is institutionally allergic to legend. It exists to deal with real events, real dangers, real crises at sea. It does not typically publish ghost stories. There is, in the layers of this story, a recurring quality that is difficult to account for in purely rational terms. Not the supernatural. Not the occult. Something more slippery than that. A quality of absence. Of erasure. As if the story of the Ourang Medan has been, from its very beginning, surrounded by a kind of deliberate silence. As if the people who knew the most about what happened have been the most silent of all. This is the territory where history and mystery blur. Where the documented facts, the radio transmissions, the Coast Guard report, the contemporary newspaper accounts, intersect with the undocumented spaces. The missing registry. The missing cargo records. The missing crew. Let us go back to the ship one more time. Back to the boarding party, crossing from the Silver Star in the early morning light. Back to that first moment when they stepped onto the deck and felt the wrongness of the air. Imagine what that felt like. You are a sailor. You have spent your career at sea. You have seen storms and strandings and the various disasters that the ocean can visit on human beings. You know what a ship in distress looks like. You know the signs. And as you cross onto this vessel, everything about it looks normal. The equipment is intact. The structure is sound. The routines of the ship appear to have been interrupted mid-execution rather than abandoned. And then you find the first body. And then the second. And then you understand that every person on the ship is dead. What are you thinking in that moment? You're scanning for explanations. You're looking for the fire, the flood, the collision, the thing that explains what happened. You're doing what human minds do in the face of death. Reaching for a narrative, a cause, a sequence of events that makes it comprehensible. Because comprehensibility is the thing that separates a tragedy from a horror. A tragedy has a cause. A horror has a presence. And the men who boarded the Ourang Medan found something that fell, distinctly, into the category of horror. They found death without cause. Death without explanation. Death with an expression on its face that suggested it had arrived not as a process but as an encounter. As if the crew of the Ourang Medan had not died of something. As if they had died before something. Whatever was in that hold, whatever had been leaking or reacting or radiating or simply existing in whatever form it took, we will never know. Because the explosion saw to that. Because the Ourang Medan, in its final act, consumed itself, destroyed the evidence, became, in the most literal possible sense, a mystery. In the decades since 1947, the Ourang Medan has become one of the defining maritime mysteries of the modern era. It has been the subject of articles, books, documentaries, and investigations that span the spectrum from rigorous historical scholarship to the most florid speculation. It has been cited as evidence of chemical weapons smuggling, of alien encounters, of paranormal phenomena, of government cover-ups. It has been used to argue for the existence of sea monsters, of ghost ships, of zones of electromagnetic anomaly in the Strait of Malacca. Most of these theories say more about the people who propose them than about the events they seek to explain. The Ourang Medan has become a kind of projection screen for our anxieties about the ocean, about the uncanny, about the possibility of death without explanation, about the fragility of human bodies and human institutions in the face of forces we cannot name. But beneath the mythology, something real happened. Something happened on a ship in the Strait of Malacca in 1947 or 1948. A crew died. A radio operator sent a message and then fell silent. The ship burned and sank. And then, the mystery took a darker turn. Because the question that haunts this story most persistently is not what killed the crew of the Ourang Medan. The question that haunts it is what the radio operator knew, in those final moments, that compelled him to say what he said in the way that he said it. He could have said, crew incapacitated, or medical emergency, or any of the standard formulations that distress signals use. He could have transmitted coordinates and waited for help. He could have reported the situation with the clinical remove that professional radio operators are trained to maintain. Instead, he said, I die. 2 words. In the first person. Present tense. Not, I am dying. Not, I am dead. Present tense. As if in the moment of transmission, he had already crossed into the territory he was describing. As if death was not arriving but was already there. Already present. Already taking him as he formed the words. What did he know? What did he see, in those last seconds? Was he watching the others die around him, one by one, waiting for his own turn and determined to leave something? Some record, some testimony, some gesture toward the world that would still exist after he was gone? Was he experiencing something that made the transmission itself a final act of will, a refusal to disappear without at least marking the moment? Or was there something else? Some presence, some force, something in the darkness of that hold or on that deck that he was describing? Not his own dying, but the arrival of something that was going to kill him? We cannot know. We will never know. The ocean is, at its core, a place of secrets. It covers more than 70% of the Earth's surface, and the majority of it remains unmapped, unexplored, inadequately understood. Every year, ships disappear in waters that should be safe, in conditions that should be manageable, under circumstances that should be survivable. Many of them are found. Some of them are not. And a very few of them, a handful scattered across the years, are found in conditions that resist explanation. That send experienced investigators away shaking their heads. That leave no thread to pull, no seam to open, no narrative that absorbs all the details without leaving some terrible remainder. The SS Ourang Medan belongs to that last category. It sits at the edge of the explainable, close enough to the known world to suggest a rational cause, far enough from documentation to resist confirmation. It has the quality of all truly unsettling mysteries, not impossible, but inexplicable, not supernatural, but not quite natural, not a ghost story, but a story about the limits of what we can know, because the ocean does not preserve its dead the way the land does. There are no ruins of the Ourang Medan resting on the floor of the Strait of Malacca that we can photograph and study. There are no bodies preserved in the cold water. There is no hold of cargo to be lifted and analyzed. There is nothing but the accounts of the people who were there. Accounts that are partial, that are colored by experience and trauma, and the strange distortions that memory applies to the inexplicable, and the signal. Always, the signal. All officers including captain are dead, lying in chart room and bridge, possibly whole crew dead. Pause. I die. That signal was real. Multiple operators received it. Multiple ships responded to it. Whatever else is uncertain about this story, and almost everything is uncertain, the signal was real. A human being, in the final moments of their life, reached out across the darkness and sent those words into the world. Made that last, minimal, terrible testimony. And the world, in the years since, has been unable to do anything with it. Unable to place it, to explain it, to resolve it into a narrative that absorbs it. The signal floats, still. The words persist. I die. 2 words from a person whose name we don't know, from a ship whose existence we cannot confirm, in a moment that we cannot reconstruct. There is something almost unbearable about this. Not the horror of it, though there is horror in it, but the loneliness. The isolation of those final moments. The radio operator, in whatever darkness had descended on that ship, reaching for the one thing left to him. Contact. Connection. The human need to say to another human being, I am here. This is happening. Remember me. Whatever killed the crew of the Ourang Medan, whatever sank the ship and erased the evidence and left only questions behind, it could not erase that. The transmission got through. The signal was received. Someone, somewhere, heard those words. And 80 years later, across an ocean of uncertainty, we are still listening.